Yeah, thanks for having me this morning. I know that I'm a regular speaker at AgriFocus, and it usually is nice to get out into the paddock and see some of the trials that other people have. What I'm going to do as the sort of opening part of this annual ryegrass management session with James is that I'm going to talk about some of the things that I've learned over probably the last 10 years of working in the high rainfall zones of Victoria, South Australia and a bit in Tasmania about how do we manage annual ryegrass. And so what I want to do, I think, is really just give you perhaps the three big tips of things that we've learnt. And James will talk later about our long-term trial at Lake Bolac, which has underpinned a lot of what I'm going to talk about. So let's see if I can, yeah, right. So I think one of the things that we learnt really early on in terms of managing ryegrass, particularly as resistance to the post-emergent herbicides evolved in southern Victoria and in the southeast of South Australia, was that crop rotations are just really important. One of the issues that we have with a lot of cereals in rotations is that they make management of ryegrass difficult when the only tools you've got really are pre-emergent herbicides. And break crops have allowed us to employ a whole bunch of other practices. And so they have become really part of the rotational tool to help you get on top of ryegrass. So a lot of the trials that we've run, the long-term trials we've run, what we tend to see is that, you know, ryegrass numbers go up in the cereals. Maybe we can just hold them steady. The only way to bring them down is in the break crops. And certainly where we've been able to employ double break crops, so two in a row, that's really helped us drive the ryegrass numbers down. So that's probably the first big tip is, you know, get that crop rotation right, and you'll set yourself up for a much better level of ryegrass control. The second thing that we've learned has been the importance of pre-emergent herbicides in the high rainfall zone. And, you know, certainly when I first started working with Southern Farming Systems, you know, pre-emergent herbicides were just really not on their radar. And I was doing all this work with other farming systems elsewhere. And we're running trials on what became Sakura at that stage. And I wanted to bring all of these practices down. And it was a pretty big learning curve, I think, for everybody in that environment, because a lot of the things that we were using in that medium rainfall zone just really didn't cut the mustard in the high rainfall zone. So, but we did learn that, you know, I think throughout the rotation, and it's not just in cereals, but particularly in cereals, the pre-emergent herbicides are a really important part of getting ryegrass management right. So you need to make sure you get the right package with the crop, and certainly most of the trial work we've done, you know, one pre-emergent herbicide is just not enough. You know, one of the things that we pioneered down in southern Victoria, for example, that we'd brought from elsewhere was Sakura plus Avadex as being the starting point. Southern Victoria saw some of our first trials with post-emergent Boxer Gold, following another pre-emergent herbicide up front. And we found that we have to have these mixtures or sequences. Now we've got a new range of products coming, and so that's going to make that space both a lot more challenging in that there's more products and more things that can go wrong, but also give a lot more opportunity for doing that. And the other part of that is adding in crop competition. One of the things that we know about pre-emergent herbicides is we can put all of these pre-emergent herbicides down, get really good early control of ryegrass, but in the high rainfall zone, ryegrass just keeps germinating, and it'll germinate all the way through to early spring if the rain's right. And by then, all the pre-emergent herbicides have run out of puff. Even our best ones are out of action by then. And so you need to have something that's going to try and keep the lid on those later ryegrass plants emerging. And crop competition is the tool you have in cereals to do that, and in canola. And the only place the crop competition doesn't really work very well is in impulse crops like beans and lupins. I've got a couple of photographs on the bottom there, and these are from a trial we were running at Francis with the McKillop group. The one on the left there, we've actually planted on wide row spacings, just as a part of a learning curve to understand the importance of crop competition. And so they were on 16-inch rows, and the other one's on 8-inch rows. And all that happened on the 16-inch rows, that all that inter-row space just filled up with ryegrass. The ryegrass is still there in the other plots. It's not getting a chance to grow. So getting that component of the package right is as important as getting the crop rotation part right. So I think it's about thinking through the options you have, working out which ones are going to work in the rotation that you're going to be using, and which are the best products for your environment, because they do work better. Some of them do work better in some environments than others. And I think the final point that we've learned is that we can do everything up front in the season. We can get all of that right, but we've still got that late ryegrass at the back end of the season. And if you just let that ryegrass go, that's what tops up that weed seed bank every year, and why we have a continuing problem with ryegrass management in the high rainfall zone. So even if we do, and we've seen this at our long-term trials, even if we do drive the numbers down to relatively low levels, if we have a year where it gets away from us, 2016 was a good example of that, where we had a really wet spring and the ryegrass tended to get away from us because we ran out of tools we could use. You just top that seed bank straight back up again. So, stopping seed set with whatever practices that you've got. We've used a lot of crop topping, and certainly, I was also involved in the development of glyphosate as a crop topping tool for canola, just to provide some extra practices. But harvest weed seed controls certainly another option that you can use. We know it's not as effective in the higher rainfall zone as it is elsewhere, but certainly the work that Southern Farming Systems has done around that and has shown that even though you're not getting as much as you would in some of the other areas, that ryegrass control you're getting is still valuable. And you can even package them together. So, this is a situation where, had a canola crop that was getting pretty weedy with ryegrass early on in the season, and it had both crop topping and harvest weed seed control. In this case, it was a chaff lining. And in the wheat the next year, in the areas where the chaff lines weren't, you went from getting pretty much to a lawn of ryegrass. You could tidy that right up by doing both of them. So I think you shouldn't be afraid of taking a couple of opportunities at the far end of the season in terms of trying to reduce those numbers down. So I really was, my job was really, I think, in a bit to set the scene about what the big tips are. And I think that if you can employ those three in your cropping system, then you're going to have a lot better management of ryegrass. Resistance is not going to be as much of an issue for you, particularly if we can get a good rotation of those pre-emergent herbicides. So at this point, I think I'm going to hand over to James to talk about some of the things that we've learnt from the Lake Bolac trial in particular, and so some local flavour, if you like. Over to you, James.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, so what we're going to do now is have a look at the results from our long-term Lake Bolac trial, which really quite beautifully illustrates everything Chris has been telling us. Just in the process of getting this set up. Okay, so what we're looking at with this long-term trial is like a case study, basically, about everything that Chris has just told us. This trial is pretty unique. It started in Lake Bolac. I think Chris was there at the beginning, John Midwood, and the GRDC Southern Panel were all there. They were looking at this paddock where resistant ryegrass was being difficult to control. And they realized that there was an opportunity here to set something in place that could really provide value for what do you do in a situation where ryegrass is challenging to control. And it's a pretty unique trial in that it's been going since 2012, so coming up in 10 years, and we're in our last year now. So it's a pretty unique trial and pretty unique host who's been willing to have us for all this time. It's had 3 phases, which I'll be referring to as we go through the story. The first phase, the first few years, we looked at a few cultural controls, looking at stubble management. I won't talk about that so much. Then the second phase was a rotation. We did a double break, beans and canola. And the third phase was we've been focusing on crop competition after that double break. But every year, there have been 3 herbicide strategies. So MS1, or Management Strategy 1, is a low input, low cost system. Management Strategy 2, which is a medium cost, medium input system, and MS3, which is a high input, high cost system. And we've been tracking how those strategies have worked over time. So what I want to do is take you through the story, and we'll see that each of the things that Chris has been telling us are playing a role in the trial. So the first thing we saw in phase 1 was that the ryegrass numbers increased over those first few years, and that looked like this. We have an increase in ryegrass numbers across the board, but you can see that MS3, the high input, high cost system, has remained lower in ryegrass head numbers at the end of the year, each year, but starting to get a separation in 2014. In 2015, when things got away a bit, you see a really big separation between the different management strategies. But I mean, the thing to point out is that you can see that MS3, the high input, high cost system, has been increasing over those 4 years, just at a much slower rate. So it just shows the kind of pressure around it. Even when we go really hard, what we're doing here is reducing the population growth. It's still growing. We're just keeping a lid on it. But it also goes back to what Chris was talking about, the importance of rotations. In these 4 years, we have 3 cereals and only 1 canola. So the cereals are a situation where the herbicides really are important, but ryegrass numbers still growing. And it was in response to this situation that they went into phase 2 with a double break. And that really did drop the ryegrass numbers, and that looked like this. So 2012 to 2015 is the same numbers that you saw before. 2016, very wet year, in beans, not as much crop competition. The ryegrass head numbers really exploded by the end of that year. We're able to contain them in our high input system, but with desiccating the beans, desiccating the canola, we're able to drop the ryegrass numbers to very low levels by the end of 2017, and they remained quite low into 2018. So again, double break really made a big difference. Balanced the corrected the balance between cereals and non-cereals in the system, and we're seeing the role of the herbicides over time, keeping a lid on the growth of the numbers, but still growing and needing that double break to actually bring things under control. So end of 2017, we've done a double break. We've brought the ryegrass numbers down under control. The question is, can you breathe easy now? Or what happens after you do something drastic like a double break? You might cut the hay. You might throw a lot of really quite big interventions in here. What happens after that? I'm jumping ahead of myself though, but before we look at that, just something to point out that even though we had a large increase in ryegrass numbers over this time, even though there was population growth at each management strategy. Having the more intense herbicides did affect grain yield over time. So if you stack up all of the grain yields for each of those years from 2012 to 2017, the medium input system gained us 6% in grain yield compared to the low input, and the high input system gained us 12% in grain yield over those 6 years compared to the low input system. So even if they're not controlling completely dropping ryegrass numbers or completely flatlining the ryegrass numbers, they are helping us increase yield over time. So following that double break, what we've seen is that you shouldn't take a break from ryegrass control after a double break. The ryegrass numbers have, what they've done after that double break has depended on what we did following the double break. Where we've gone hard, we've kept the ryegrass numbers low, and where we've been a bit lax, let them go a bit, they've increased again. And I can show you that with looking at our 2019 year in particular. So last year, 2019, we sowed Ignite TT canola on May 8th, so a later sowing date. We did a standard sowing rate and a low sowing rate. So our standard sowing rate got us 40 plants per square meter, and our lower sowing rate got us 18 plants per square meter. And the idea here was to illustrate the role that crop competition is playing. There's been some talk maybe with a hybrid canola, you don't need as many plants there because they're more vigorous. But bearing in mind, this is the lower sowing rate. And we also got a bit of a grain yield increase from the high sowing rate, so that's always nice. But the really interesting thing is what that situation did to the ryegrass seed head numbers by the end of the year. It looked like this. Our yellow line is our standard sowing rate, and you can see that for each management strategy, it's consistently got fewer ryegrass heads than the low sowing rate. So we're seeing here that the herbicides are making a stepwise decrease in ryegrass head numbers. A more intense herbicide strategy is decreasing the ryegrass numbers. But no matter what your herbicide is, the crop competition of a standard sowing rate is lending a helping hand. They're working together in every situation. And this has had a legacy effect. So if you look at that pattern and then you think about what it might look like in terms of ryegrass plant numbers in 2020, what we saw is this the same pattern. So this is the ryegrass plant numbers in July of this year. And you can see the same pattern, that our standard sowing rate from our canola of last year has meant that there continues to be fewer ryegrass plants in the middle of this year, and our management strategies are doing the same thing still. The thing I want to point out to you here is that we are down to 3 plants per square meter of ryegrass when we've had an intense herbicide strategy, high cost, high input system with crop competition. We have brought numbers down and kept them low in that situation. That's 10 years later. The ryegrass hasn't gotten any less resistant to herbicides. It's a long time, lots of things can go wrong, but we've used a double break, we've brought numbers under control, and we've kept them low 3 years later by combining all of these strategies. So this trial is like a demonstration of what's possible and maybe necessary in the high rainfall zone. And I want you to sort of think about it like a footy game. We've got the grand final coming up. You wouldn't build a strategy around going really hard at the beginning and then coasting the rest of the game. You wouldn't try to catch up in the middle or the end of the game. The best teams that get to the grand final and make it through to the end of the season are the ones that have a strong early, mid, and end game. So agronomists, you think of yourself like the coach. You're not going to suggest just pick one of them. Growers, you're like the players. You're not going to just get your team to go hard at one point. You really want to do well the whole year round, the whole game long. So our early game is the pre-emergent strategy that Chris was talking about. We saw that will reduce population growth. We saw that in 2012 to 15, phase 1, we were able to keep the lid down, the lid on the population growth at that time. Our mid game is crop competition. We saw that worked in most situations, and it lent a helping hand with a legacy effect from 2019 to 2020. And we saw the importance of the end game. When we had the desiccation of the double break, that really crashed the numbers in 2016 and 2017. And that also, you know, might suggest that things like harvest weed seed control could be helpful because they're an option that we have even in the cereal rotation too. But we also saw that everything is better together. 3 plants per square meter, 10 years later, when we're managing resistant ryegrass, I think that's a really successful story. So I think this all makes sense. We've shown that it works in your neck of the woods. I think this is all pretty clear. It's just a question now for you. What combinations are going to work for you? Thanks, Michelle. That's it from me.
Thank you, James. So anyone got any questions for Chris or James? Feel free to put them in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask James or Chris directly. While we're waiting for some questions to come in. So from your presentation, by implementing good crop rotations and mixing up our different practices, sort of is our best bet to get rid of ryegrass out of our cropping system. Is that?
Yeah, Michelle, I think from everything we've learnt, and all the, I mean, James showed some of the data, but we've put some economic numbers around a lot of our trials, and it's been fairly rare for us to not make money despite throwing everything that we've got at ryegrass. And so I think, you know, in this high rainfall zone, you can actually really push the system quite hard and still come out the back end profitable. And I think a lot of it's about making the right choices. And I think that's where the difficult component comes in, is making sure that you get it right. And you can see from our early phase of the Lake Bolac experiment, we got the herbicide component of it right. We didn't actually get the crop rotation part of it right. And, you know, that's been the bit that we've had to learn.
Yeah, you can't just rely on one component working. You need to use both.
Well, I think, you know, I pointed to 3, and I think you need to be using all 3 of those in this environment to make it work.
Any more questions from the audience? We had some struggling with internet there. So hi James, my internet struggled. Moral of the story, don't take the foot off the ryegrass throttle, keep having a go. Is that the moral?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we've seen that, I mean, that we saw that with after the double break. So we used a double break, we crashed the ryegrass numbers, and if you let, you know, the foot off the throttle, or you reduce the pressure on the brake, however you want to use the metaphor, the ryegrass numbers took off again, but when we kept the pressure on, they stayed low and even got a bit lower. So yeah, it's a matter of every year, like the Weed Smart logo. It's every year, everything every year, basically. And that's particularly true in our environment. Like if we've got a productive environment where we've got high grain yields, it's like high seed yield for annual ryegrass, and their ability to produce seeds is pretty phenomenal. So we're in an environment where we're dealing with rocket fuel here. So we want to not let it have any chance to take off.
Doesn't seem to be any more questions coming through. They do take a little bit of time to come through in the chat box. Scott, do you have any questions?
Oh, just put the chairman on the spot. No, look, I think that what they've covered, and and that's last year we've been at that site, we will be at that site, and it's been a fantastic spot to do it, because it was all of those of us that can remember it early days, there was no shortage of ryegrass there, and it's been fantastic to see those numbers drop in those last few years by those couple of methods. And I think James is right, and the way we used to describe it with serrated tussock was it was like a coil spring. At the moment, if you take your foot off the coil spring, it hits you in the face. And ryegrass is exactly the same as that. It's just a matter of, when you're on a good thing, just keep doing it and rotate everything to control. So unless there's any more questions, Michelle, have you got any there? Or
No, there's, hang on, there's one more. Was the canola direct harvested as part of the trial, or would windrowing have been the same effect during a double break?
I haven't been here as long as the trial has. In 2019, it was direct-headed. I think before that, it's most generally been direct-headed. Do you recall, Chris? And do you know?
Yeah, it's been, as a trial, and most trials are direct-headed. But I think we actually have done some more whole paddock work in the last couple of years, or larger plot work, I should say, in the last couple of years, where we've been using a lot of farmer equipment. And you know, that slide I showed you of the wheat crop after the canola full of ryegrass, that not only had crop topping, it was windrowed, and then the windrows were harvest weed seed control was put over the top of that, so the chaff lining on the top of that. So what windrowing will do is, because you're going a little bit earlier than direct heading, you'll actually chop some of that ryegrass off and actually put it in the windrow, and it just makes the opportunity to do harvest weed seed control better. So that's been part of what's helped there.
Yeah, Gina has put a comment that it has been harvested with farmer equipment, not plot equipment. So we've been using the standard commercial operations. Any more questions before we move along? Thank you, Chris and James.